Someone in your family knew how to press bison fat and dried meat into a bar lasting 100 days, seal butter under salt brine through April, or read packed snow outside the cabin like a larder. That knowledge is gone. Here are 30 genius mountain man blizzard hacks that actually work. Pemmican was the closest thing to a miracle food the Rocky Mountains ever produced, and the Cree people who invented it weren't sharing the formula with just anyone. The process took days. Thin strips of bison dried in the hot sun until brittle, then pounded between flat stones into a coarse powder barely recognizable as meat. Rendered tallow went in equal measure by weight, warm and liquid, sometimes with dried choke cherries or Saskatoon berries crushed fine. The mixture was packed into rawhide bags while still hot, compressed as it cooled, the bags sewn shut. What came out was a calorie brick that wouldn't freeze, wouldn't spoil, and could sustain a trapper through 2 weeks of blizzard on nothing else. The demand for it triggered the Pemmican War of 1814 between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, fighting over the Red River supply. You needed 5 pounds of fresh meat to make 1 pound of finished pemmican. The math alone told you everything about the patience it required. Nobody called it skilly-gally on a good day. That name came out only when things were desperate enough to admit what you were actually eating. Hardtack was 3 ingredients: flour, water, salt, baked so long and low that every trace of moisture baked out, and the result could sit in a haversack for years. Civil War soldiers were rationed 9 squares per day, and eating in the dark was a blessing. In the dark, you couldn't see the weevils floating in your coffee cup after you'd crumbled the biscuit in to soften it. The mountain man's fix was simpler. Render pork fat in cast iron until it shimmered, drop the hardtack in until it soaked up the grease and went golden at the edges, and what came off the fire resembled a pancake with no right to taste as good as it did. John Billings named the technique skilly-gally in his 1887 memoir, Hardtack and Coffee. The men who ate it called it supper. Civil War hardtack, still displayed in museums, is theoretically edible after 160 years. Not one person has volunteered to confirm that. She knew the temperature without a thermometer. You went down the wooden ladder and the cold hit you different than outside cold. Steady and even, never biting, just holding. Root cellars worked because the earth 6 feet down stays 50 to 60 degrees year-round, and that narrow band between too warm to store and too cold to freeze was what stood between a mountain family and starvation through winter. Shelves lined every wall. Canning jars, potatoes in barrels, turnips bedded in sawdust, hams on iron hooks. When refrigerators became standard in Appalachian homes in the 1950s and 60s, the cellar doors stopped being opened every morning and rotted shut on their hinges. The knowledge of how to read what was down there, which jar had gone bad, which smell meant 2 days before you lost a whole shelf, went with the women who had kept that inventory in their heads without ever writing a number down. The trick with parched corn was heat and patience, and knowing when to pull it. If you had to ask, you weren't ready to be making it. Dry field corn, fully matured and hard as gravel, went into a cast iron skillet over low heat, stirred constantly, and over the course of an hour the kernels toasted from pale gold to deeper brown, the starch converting into something shelf-stable and dense that needed no cooking and no moisture to survive months in a buckskin pouch. Lewis and Clark called their version sagamite, borrowed from Native American trail rations, and their 1806 journals document parched corn and dried meat as the core of the expedition diet on the hardest stretches. A handful in your coat pocket suppressed hunger for hours. It couldn't freeze, couldn't rot, couldn't be ruined by a river crossing. What began as a grain nobody would eat raw became the most reliable survival food in the mountain tradition. Not because it tasted good, but because it was always there when nothing else was. Before anyone drove a horse-drawn scraper across a frozen lake to cut ice blocks for sale, mountain families already had a working cold storage system built into every blizzard, and the ones who understood how to use it properly ate well through storms that left their neighbors desperate. Fresh-killed game wrapped in burlap or hide and packed into a drift on the north side of the cabin, never the south, not even in January, cured in the sustained, dry cold, the same way a modern walk-in cooler takes days to replicate. Crocks of fresh milk set into packed snow kept 3 to 4 times longer than they'd last indoors. The principle was simple: below freezing, steady, with the meat or crock insulated from direct freeze by the snowpack itself. The rule about the north side was unwritten and non-negotiable. A south-facing drift softened in afternoon sun even in deep January, and softened meat was ruined meat. You didn't need to be told that more than once. The ones who learned it from a lost quarter carcass in October never needed reminding for the rest of their lives. Bannock traveled to the Rocky Mountains in the packs of Scottish fur traders and French-Canadian voyageurs who called it galette, and by the time it reached Cree and Ojibwe hands, it had been made entirely their own. The original came from Scotland, a heavy oatmeal bread baked on a flat stone over peat coals. In the mountains, it became leaner: flour, salt, a spoonful of lard or bear grease, enough water to bring the dough together. You could wrap a rope of it around a peeled green stick and hold it over coals until the hollow knock of your knuckles said it was done. You never pricked it, you listened. You could press it flat in the skillet and prop the pan toward the fire, letting reflected heat bake the top while coals did the bottom. It rose barely at all and browned unevenly, tasting of whatever fat you'd used. What it always tasted of, if you grew up eating it, was the woman who had it ready before anyone else was awake. The smell cutting through cold and smoke before you opened your eyes. She made it every morning for 30 years. Nobody wrote down a single measurement. A single bison could yield 60 pounds of tallow, and the mountain men who understood that number grasped something the people back east had no framework for: that a large animal was not one meal but an entire winter's worth of cooking fat, light, and waterproofing rolled into one carcass, and nothing was wasted. Rendering started with the hard white fat from around the kidneys, cut into chunks and added to a pot of water over slow heat. As the temperature climbed, the fat cells burst and pure liquid tallow floated free, skimmed clean and poured into molds to cool white and firm. In a pemmican batch, it went into dried meat in equal measure by weight. In a candle mold, it lit the next 3 months. In a skillet, it fried the morning bannock. Rubbed into boot leather before a blizzard, it kept the water out. There was a moment when the crackling bits settled and the liquid ran perfectly clear. That was the sign. You didn't time it. You watched the color and listened to the sound the pot made when it was ready. Every autumn, before the first hard freeze, the barrel came out and the salting began. And the family that skipped this in a warm October was the family on its knees in a cold root cellar in February, trying to make what little was left last another 6 weeks. Pork cuts, shoulders, belly, fat back, went in rubbed with coarse salt and saltpeter, the potassium nitrate that held off bacterial growth and kept the meat from going gray in the brine. Water, more salt, and sometimes a pour of molasses went in over the top. A weighted wooden disc kept everything submerged. From that barrel came the salt pork that flavored nearly every winter meal, crumbled into dried beans, fried out for drippings before any other cooking began, laid over hardtack in the skillet. Families knew by mid-February whether they'd put up enough in October. Some years the math held, some years it didn't, and you learned to count more carefully the following fall. Ash cakes were the bread of the cabin fireplace at its most stripped down. Cornmeal and water and nothing else, cooked not near the fire but inside it. Coarse cornmeal and cold water worked by hand until the dough held shape, pressed flat and wrapped in corn husks or cabbage leaves before going directly onto the glowing coals. 5 to 7 minutes aside, and when you knocked the ash off and peeled back the husk, the crust crackled under your thumbnail and the center steamed with a smell of corn and wood smoke that no iron oven ever replicated. The corn husk wrapping was the invention. It sealed the outside in the first seconds of coal contact, keeping the interior from drying while the heat worked through. African-American cooks across the mountain south had perfected this technique across generations, passing it through households that worked without specialized cookware, with nothing beyond fire and hands and the clarity to use what was there. The ash cake was not a compromise. It was an answer. And it slipped away when the wood stove went, and the wood stove went when the gas line came. Hens slow their laying in winter. Shorter days cut the light signal that triggers egg production, and by December a mountain hen house might yield 1 egg where it had given a dozen in July. The families who planned for this did it in August, when the problem felt far away. Eggs collected the morning they were laid, never washed, the natural bloom left on the shell, were dipped in molten beeswax and set to cool. 2 coats, no bare spots. Before commercial paraffin wax became available after 1830, beeswax was the standard. The sealed eggs went into crocks lined with dry oats, then down to the root cellar. Preserved this way, eggs lasted up to 8 months without breaking down, provided you turned each crock every 2 weeks to keep the yolk from adhering to the shell. The women who managed this kept the full count in their heads, no ledger, no tally on the wall. When they were gone, the family found out in January what she had been tracking for them, silently, since August. There was a moment in the drying, usually around the 3rd day, when the strips of venison hanging from the rafters stopped smelling like raw meat and started smelling smoky and mineral and faintly sweet, and that was the sign the cure had taken. Elk and deer were the preferred jerk meats for one clear reason: lean muscle, almost no fat, which meant the strips dried evenly and wouldn't go rancid the way bear would. Captain William Clark wrote in April of 1806 that the expedition had been curing dried meat since their last encampment, strips cut paper thin with a Green River knife, scored to increase the drying surface, rubbed with salt when available, and dried raw when it wasn't. Green hickory smoke from a low, smoldering fire added both preservation and a flavor still air couldn't give. You tested finished jerk by bending a strip, flex without cracking, then snap clean when folded double. The men who got it right fed themselves for weeks. The ones who pulled it too early found out in the middle of a blizzard when the smell from the rafter hooks changed and there was nothing left to replace it. When the hog was slaughtered in late fall, the rendering of lard was the event the whole kitchen organized around, because the fat from one animal served more purposes than any item in a mountain kitchen had a right to. Leaf lard from around the kidneys went into the rendering pot first, cut small and melted over slow heat until the cracklins floated golden and clear liquid poured off into crocks. What came off a single large hog filled 8 to 10 one-gallon crocks. Lard fried the morning eggs, went into biscuit dough, seasoned the cornbread skillet, waterproofed the boots before a blizzard, treated cracked hands after a week of bitter cold, and lit the cabin when poured into a mold with a cotton wick. The cracklins left after rendering were eaten straight from the pot, still hot, impossibly rich, the kind of thing grown men ate in silence with their eyes closed. By the time Crisco hit grocery shelves in the 1930s, lard had already begun slipping from those same shelves. The women who rendered it knew what was being traded away. They didn't get a say. It cost nothing. It grew outside the door. And it was the difference between a family that made it to spring and one that started losing teeth in February. Spruce needle tea had been used by indigenous peoples of the Northeast for centuries. The Haudenosaunee showed Jacques Cartier's scurvy-ridden crew how to brew it in 1535, and the knowledge saved them. Fresh green spruce tips simmered in water until the liquid turned pale. Amber released enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy through the longest snowbound winter. You needed only a handful of tips steeped 10 minutes. The flavor was sharp, faintly piney, faintly sweet at the back of the throat. Mountain families who kept this in their winter routine stayed healthier than the ones who didn't, though almost none could have named a vitamin if you'd asked. They just knew. Green needle tea in February, and you come out of winter standing. Churning butter in deep winter was itself a kind of miracle. Warm milk, the up-down rhythm of the paddle, the moment the fat broke and the yellow mass gathered while the buttermilk went cloudy. But keeping that butter through the season was a different problem, and the women who solved it did so with nothing more than salt, cold water, and patience. The finished butter was packed tightly into a stoneware crock, pressed down until no air pockets remained, and covered with strong saltwater brine. Enough salt to float an egg, which was the measure everyone used and nobody wrote down. The brine drew out moisture, slowed bacterial growth, and kept the butter from going rancid for months. The crock went into the root cellar. In spring, what came out was still butter, firmer, saltier, faintly different in a way hard to name but unmistakable if you'd grown up eating it. The recipe was simple enough that a child could follow it. The woman who kept it in her hands without ever writing it down is gone now, and the recipe went with her. And if you thought potted butter showed what mountain women could make from almost nothing, wait until you hear what the mountain men were eating on the trail. Budan was the Rocky Mountain delicacy that would stop a modern dinner guest cold before they took a single bite. Budans were sections of fresh buffalo intestine, cleaned and turned inside out, stuffed with chopped liver, kidney fat, and wild onions, then tied off and roasted directly over a fire until the casing blistered and split, and the fat ran into the coals with a sizzle that turned heads across camp. Osborne Russell recorded in his 1835 journal that the men ate them with something close to reverence, not because they had no options, but because properly made boudins were genuinely, surprisingly good. The fat inside basted the organ meat from within while the smoke worked through the outer skin. The charred exterior gave way to something tender and rich that no cured meat could replicate. The parts nobody wanted off a kill became the parts everyone fought over at the fire. The eaves of the barn were not decoration. In mountain country, they were a working cold room that ran for free every winter, and the families who used them correctly never wasted a carcass. A freshly killed deer or elk, field-dressed and hung from a beam in the cold overhang of an outbuilding, would freeze solid within 24 hours when temperatures stayed below freezing and stay frozen and edible for weeks. The trick was temperature, cold and dry and still, which is what a north-facing barn eave delivered when a blizzard had settled in. You hung the carcass high enough that nothing on the ground could reach it, wrapped in burlap to keep the surface from drying in the wind. If the temperature climbed above freezing for more than a day, you cut what you needed and brought the rest inside to process fast. The whole system was a walk-in freezer that cost nothing to build and nothing to run, which in a mountain blizzard was all you needed it to be. Hominy was the quiet genius at the center of the Appalachian winter table, and most of the people eating it had no idea what had been done to the corn to get it there. Dried field corn was soaked in a solution of water and wood ash lye, the leaching process called nixtamalization, developed by indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica thousands of years before European contact. What the lye did was unlock niacin, a B vitamin bound up in the kernel in a form the body couldn't absorb without this treatment. Populations that ate unprocessed corn as a staple without nixtamalizing it developed pellagra, the niacin deficiency disease that swept through parts of the rural South in the early 20th century. The women who made hominy from wood ash lye were preventing that disease without knowing the word for it. They just knew the treated corn kept people healthier through a long winter. The process is more than 3,000 years old. It slipped away when canned hominy reached grocery shelves in the 1960s, and nobody wrote the wood ash method down on the way out. The bones were the last thing left after a kill, and the mountain man who knew what to do with them ate better than the one who threw them away. Large leg bones, bison, elk, deer, were split lengthwise with a heavy knife, and the halves went cut side up directly onto a bed of glowing coals. In 5 to 8 minutes, the marrow inside liquefied and began to bubble at the edges, and what came out was something fur trade accounts from the early 1800s describe as beurre de nature, a fat so rich and deeply flavored that mountain men spread it on toasted bannock the way a finer man might spread butter at a proper table. Marrow fat doesn't freeze at the same temperature as regular fat. It stays semi-liquid even in cold, which made it one of the only fats that remained usable straight from a frozen carcass. Bone marrow is now a restaurant delicacy at $40 a plate. The mountain man scraped it from a split femur with a stick, crouching over a fire in a blizzard, and he understood exactly what he had without needing anyone to tell him. The Dutch oven was the only appliance a mountain kitchen needed, and the women who knew how to use it could leave supper cooking at sunrise and come back 8 hours later to find it done. No power, no timer, no watching required. A cast-iron Dutch oven filled with soaked dried beans and a piece of salt pork was nestled into hearth coals, with coals piled on the lid too. The heat came from all sides at once, the thick iron held it evenly, and what came out had the deep, integrated flavor that comes only from slow heat and undisturbed time. Mountain families who left a Dutch oven going through a full day of outdoor work came home to the smell of it from 50 feet away. Salt pork and beans and wood smoke and the sweetness of something that's been going for 8 uninterrupted hours. Nobody makes it like that anymore. The cast iron is still sitting in someone's attic, still good, still waiting. Pine resin, gathered from the scarred bark of any pine or spruce tree, was one of the mountain man's most indispensable materials, and it cost nothing but the time to collect it. Melted at low heat, it ran as a dark amber liquid that flowed into cracks, sealed around crock lids, waterproofed wooden buckets and leather pouches, and hardened on cooling into a seal nearly as good as modern rubber. You rendered crystallized chunks over low heat in late summer and fall, strained out bark through a cloth, and stored the finished pitch in a tin. A prepared mountain household didn't let that tin run empty, because flour could be stretched, but a cracked crock with no way to reseal it meant lost food, and in a blizzard, lost food was a different kind of emergency. The knowledge of which trees gave the best pitch, how to thin it for different uses, how to tell fresh run from old hardened crust, that was the kind of thing a man learned by watching and never found in a book. Navy beans were the insurance policy of the mountain winter, cheap to buy in bulk before the freeze, light to store in quantity, and capable of becoming something entirely different once you put them in a pot with salt pork and thyme. The dried beans soaked overnight and by morning had swelled enough to start the long cook. Salt pork went in, the fattier the better, and the pot went over low heat for most of the day, uncovered for the last hour to let the broth reduce into something thick and savory. Mountain families made this soup every week through winter because it required almost nothing they didn't already have, fed everyone from one pot, and tasted better than its ingredients deserved. What made it good wasn't skill so much as time, the slow conversion of humble dried legumes into something that stuck to your ribs through a day of working in the cold. She made it every Thursday. You could smell it from the front porch. The recipe wasn't a recipe. It was a ratio she carried in her hands and her nose, and it left the table the day she did. Potatoes could be stored loose in a root cellar barrel, but carrots, parsnips, and turnips were a different problem. Left on their own in a cold room, they dried out, shriveled, and lost both nutrition and flavor by January. The answer was as simple as it was counterintuitive. Pack them in dry sand. Wooden boxes filled with dry coarse sand, the root vegetables layered so none were touching, each layer covered and packed before the next went in. The sand held moisture at a constant level around each vegetable, preventing both drying and the condensation that caused rot. It kept individual roots from spreading mold if one began to soften, and it buffered against the brief freeze events that could pass through even a good root cellar on a very cold night. By mid-January, when loose turnips in a barrel had gone soft and rubbery, the sand-packed ones were still firm enough to cube for a stew. The families who knew this trick came out of winter with vegetables that tasted like fall. The ones who didn't came out eating slop. Long before anyone sold bone broth in paper cups at a premium, mountain families cracked knuckle bones of bison and elk into a pot of water and boiled them for hours because they understood without knowing the words collagen or amino acids that something valuable came out of those bones that didn't come from the meat alone. The knuckle joints were cracked with a hatchet to expose the marrow-rich interior, added to cold water with whatever wild herbs were available, and left at a low boil for most of the day until the liquid turned white and thick. The fat that rose was skimmed into the tallow supply. What stayed became the base for every winter stew, the liquid poured over dried beans, the warming drink handed to sick children when nothing else helped. Frontier medical practice from the 1800s recommended bone broth for recovery from fever and exhaustion. The women who made it hadn't read a medical text. They just knew it worked. In late September, before the first frost, The apples too bruised to store whole went into the biggest pot in the kitchen and cooked down over low heat until the cabin smelled sweet and sharp at once, the smell of apples giving themselves over into something thicker and more concentrated. Wild honey went in if there was any to spare. The mixture was stirred to jam thickness, spread thin onto wooden boards or clean cloth, and set near the fire to dry for 2 or 3 days. What came off was apple leather, pliable, intensely flavored, shelf-stable for months, light enough to carry in a coat pocket on a blizzard day when you needed something real. Every woman made it differently. Some added cinnamon bark, some dried berries, some kept the skins in for color. You could tell whose was whose by the sweetness. Nobody taught you by recipe. You learned by standing next to her while she worked. But apple leather was the mountain kitchen's gentlest transformation. Bear grease was its most elemental one, a single rendered fat that crossed every boundary between food, medicine, and tool. Black bear fat, gathered after the animal had spent summer building its winter store, was rendered slowly over low heat, skimmed clean, and stored in a sealed crock in the root cellar. You fried with it when lard ran short. You rubbed it into cracked skin and frost-bitten ears when the cold had done its work. You waterproofed boots with it before every storm. Mixed with pine tar, it kept harness leather from stiffening in the cold. A single large bear, properly rendered, could fill 4 to 6 crocks, enough to carry a mountain household through January, February, and into the lean weeks of March. The choice of wood was everything, and the families who smoked their fish over green alder understood something that hickory and oak smokers of the flatlands never quite grasped. Green alder burns cool and produces a smoke faintly sweet, almost tannic, with none of the heavy tar that other green hardwoods give off. River trout and whitefish split and hung on racks above a smoldering alder fire. For 12 to 24 hours absorbed that smoke evenly, the flesh deepening from pale pink to copper to amber, each stage telling you where you were in the cure. The finished fish, wrapped in cloth or packed in a dry wooden box, kept 2 to 3 months without refrigeration, protein for the deep of winter, when the streams were frozen and the nets were stored. You knew the smoke was right when it smelled a certain way, and the fish told you so. You learned it from watching, not from reading. You knew you had it when someone older watched you work without saying a word. There was always a barrel of Blackstrap molasses in the root cellar corner, behind the bean sacks and the salt pork, because molasses was the food of last resort, the calorie reserve you touched only when everything else had run out. Blackstrap, the darkest and most mineral-rich grade, was what most mountain households could afford. Thick, bitter, dense with iron and calcium that white sugar lacked entirely. A tablespoon stirred into cornmeal mush sweetened it enough to eat when there was nothing else alongside it. Poured into hot water, it kept a man working through a cold morning. The barrel lasted all winter if you were careful. Some years careful wasn't enough. By March, the barrel was at the bottom and the family was counting days to the thaw. She always knew exactly how much was left. You could find her in the cellar some evenings, tilting the barrel just slightly, listening to the sound of it. German and Swiss settlers carried sauerkraut making into the Appalachian Mountains in the 1700s and 1800s, and by the time it passed through 2 generations of mountain households, it had stopped being German at all. It was just what you did with the late fall cabbage before the freeze took it. Cabbage was shredded fine, packed into a stoneware crock in layers with coarse salt, and pressed down hard until the brine rose above the surface. A weighted stone kept everything submerged. The lacto-fermentation over the following weeks transformed raw vegetable into something sour and alive, rich in vitamin C through a winter of preserved and dried foods. The women who learned this from their mothers taught it to their daughters. Then the daughters moved to town and stopped making it, and nobody said out loud that something was being lost. Before the blizzard hit, always before, never during, the rope went up. One end tied to the cabin door handle, the other stretched across the yard to the barn door, running taut at chest height so a hand reaching in the dark and the howling white could find it without thinking. The Great Plains blizzard of 1888, the one old-timers called the schoolchildren's storm, killed hundreds of people who stepped outside in conditions they thought they could navigate by landmark and instinct, and were wrong. Mountain families who strung their guide ropes before every serious storm knew what those people learned too late. In a whiteout, your barn is invisible from 10 feet away, and the cold will drop you before your mind catches up. The rope kept livestock alive, and livestock kept the family fed. No milk, no butter, no draft animals, no hauling wood. Today, there are no ropes strung across the yard. The barns are mostly gone anyway. The hardest weeks of a mountain winter weren't the ones in January when the storms were fiercest. Those weeks you survived on what you'd put up. The hardest weeks came in late February and into March, when the cold had softened just enough to feel like hope. But the root cellar shelves were bare, and the bean sacks were light, and the salt pork barrel had been scraped to the bottom. You rationed, you stretched, you made cornmeal go further than it was supposed to go and told yourself there was still plenty when there wasn't, because the children were watching your face to know how scared to be. This was the arithmetic that defined a mountain winter, not the storms, but the counting. Not the cold, but the math of whether what you had would hold until what was coming could be gathered. Every family that made it through a hard winter carried that arithmetic in their bones for the rest of their lives, and when they were gone, the counting went with them. Vinegar copper cleaner transformed tarnished pots, pans, and hardware into gleaming surfaces using nothing but pantry vinegar and table salt. The method was simple enough that children could help with the task, mixing white vinegar with salt to create a paste that cut through oxidation and grime. Families would rub this mixture onto copper surfaces using old rags or their bare hands, watching dark tarnish dissolve away to reveal the warm orange metal underneath. The chemical reaction between acid and salt broke down the oxidized layer without scratching or damaging the copper beneath. Mountain households took pride in their copper cookware, often passed down through generations, and this cleaning method kept heirloom pieces functional and beautiful. The same mixture worked on brass door hardware, cabinet pulls, and decorative items throughout the home. No store-bought polish could match the effectiveness or the satisfaction of watching grime disappear. She fed it every morning the way she fed the dog, without thinking, without measuring, just a handful of flour and a splash of water stirred into the crock before the rest of the kitchen woke up. The sourdough starter in some Appalachian homes was older than the women who kept it alive, passed from mother to daughter in a jar wrapped in a dish towel, carried across state lines and guarded like it was worth something. Because it was. Before commercial yeast was widely available, that bubbling crock of wild-captured yeast and lactobacillus was the only way to make bread rise. Families in the Smoky Mountains and the Ozarks kept starters going for decades, and the flavor changed depending on the local flour and the bacteria in the air. A starter raised in one hollow tasted different from one in the next. When a young bride left home, she took a piece of the starter with her. When the woman who started it died, the crock stayed on the counter and someone else took over the feeding. The bread kept rising. It just never tasted exactly the same. Salt pork and wild greens turned the harsh mountain landscape into a plate of rich sustenance. Hunters carried slabs of salt-cured pork that kept for months without spoiling, slicing off pieces to fry in iron skillets until the fat rendered into a fragrant base. Foraged greens like dandelion, mustard, or young nettles were added to the sizzling pan, their bitter edges mellowing in the smoky drippings. A sprinkle of coarse salt and a dash of creek water finished the dish, creating a simple yet powerful meal full of essential minerals and fats. Mountain men praised the way the greens cut through the heaviness of pork, while the pork turned wild leaves into a feast worthy of the long trails. Gatherers moved silently through meadows at dawn to find the freshest shoots, knowing that every handful brought health and strength. Today, the idea of living off cured meat and weeds may seem distant, but the memory of that savory balance remains a testament to survival and resourceful cooking in untamed country. Coffee grounds odor absorber eliminated refrigerator smells, neutralized garbage odors, and freshened musty closets using yesterday's breakfast waste. Families discovered that dried coffee grounds absorbed unpleasant odors as effectively as expensive baking soda, pulling smells from the air and trapping them permanently. Small dishes of grounds placed in refrigerators would eliminate the mingled food odors that accumulated over weeks. The same grounds sprinkled in garbage cans prevented the worst summer smells from overwhelming kitchens. Closets and storage areas benefited from sachets filled with dried grounds, keeping mustiness at bay in spaces with limited ventilation. The grounds could be refreshed periodically by drying new batches in the sun or oven, maintaining effectiveness indefinitely. This hack represented the mountain commitment to finding second uses for everything, transforming waste into household utility. If the recipe called for buttermilk and the nearest store was an hour down the mountain, you made your own. 1 tablespoon of white vinegar stirred into a cup of whole milk, left to sit on the counter for 10 minutes until it thickened and curdled slightly around the edges. The acid in the vinegar caused the casein proteins in the milk to coagulate, mimicking the tangy thickness of real cultured buttermilk closely enough that biscuits and cornbread made with it rose just fine. Lemon juice worked the same way, but lemons were expensive in mountain kitchens. Vinegar was always on the shelf. This trick traveled through home economics classes in rural schools during the 1940s, printed on mimeographed handouts tucked into recipe boxes alongside church cookbook clippings. The old cooks who had always used fresh-churned buttermilk from the morning's milking said it was not the same, and they were right. But it kept the biscuits rising when the real thing ran out. Wild turkey. Pot pie turned a successful hunt into a dish of deep comfort on bitter mountain nights. Hunters cleaned the bird carefully, saving every piece of meat and simmering it with carrots, onions, and herbs until the broth grew rich and fragrant. A heavy cast-iron crust of flour, lard, and spring water was rolled thick and laid over the bubbling filling before the pot was set near glowing coals. Slow baking gave the crust a golden sheen while trapping steam inside so the turkey stayed tender and moist. Families gathered around the fire as the scent of roasting meat and pastry drifted through the cold air. Each slice brought warmth and gratitude, a celebration of skill and luck in a land where every meal mattered. Children learned the recipe by watching, knowing that success in the wilderness meant honoring the harvest completely. Modern kitchens rarely attempt such patient cooking, but the memory of wild turkey pot pie remains a testament to frontier hospitality and the enduring pleasure of a meal earned by hand. Potato rust remover was a surprisingly effective tool for restoring rusted cast iron, knife blades, and metal implements to working condition. The technique involved cutting a raw potato in half, dipping the cut surface into dish soap or salt, then using it to scrub rusted metal surfaces. The oxalic acid naturally present in potatoes reacted with iron oxide, loosening rust and allowing it to be wiped away easily. Families discovered this hack when polishing their precious cast iron skillets, the cornerstones of mountain cooking that needed regular maintenance to stay functional. The potato provided gentle abrasion without scratching seasoned surfaces, making it safer than steel wool or harsh chemicals that could damage the pan's coating. Children were often assigned this task, working through collections of rusty tools and kitchen implements on Saturday mornings. The method was slow but effective, requiring patience as the potato gradually broke down rust layer by layer. A pinch of salt in the coffee grounds before the water went through. That was the trick. And if you knew it, you learned it from someone who drank bad coffee for a long time before figuring it out. The salt did not make the coffee taste salty. It suppressed the bitter compounds released when cheap coffee or a percolator pushed water past the grounds too many times. In mountain kitchens where coffee was boiled in an open pot, that bitterness was unavoidable, and the salt took the edge off without adding sugar most families could not spare. Navy veterans from the Second World War brought the trick home from mess halls where the coffee was notoriously harsh, and it spread through small towns and rural diners across the South through the 1950s. Sodium ions block the taste receptors that detect bitterness, which is why a pinch improves almost anything bitter. But nobody in those kitchens needed the science. They just needed the coffee to stop tasting like punishment. Cast iron bannock. Bread offered mountain travelers a quick rustic loaf that required only flour, fat, water, and an open flame. Trappers mixed the ingredients directly in a worn pan, kneading with cold hands until the dough came together in a rough round. They buried the skillet under glowing coals or set it near the fire where heat slowly baked the bread to a golden crust while keeping the inside tender and chewy. The smell of warm grain mingled with pine smoke and damp earth, giving the meal a grounding sense of place. Bannock slices served as breakfast with a smear of wild berry jam, or as the evening side to stewed meat and beans. It held up well for days, making it ideal for long treks when supplies were scarce and every meal had to be reliable. Many travelers swore the bread tasted better with each mile, as the iron absorbed stories of every camp. Modern kitchens rarely recreate that smoky, crackling crust earned only in the heart of the wilderness. Bacon grease lamp was an emergency lighting solution that turned kitchen waste into functional illumination when kerosene ran low or power lines failed. Families saved rendered bacon fat in metal cans, knowing it could serve double duty beyond cooking. The process involved pouring the solidified grease into a shallow dish, then inserting a twisted cotton rag or piece of string as a wick. Once lit, the grease burned slowly with a steady yellow flame that could illuminate a room for hours. The light wasn't bright, but it was enough for evening chores, reading, or navigating dark hallways during storms. The smell was distinctive, a smoky bacon aroma that filled the house, but families considered it preferable to sitting in darkness. This hack represented the mountain philosophy that nothing should be wasted when it could serve another purpose. Many households kept a dedicated bacon grease lamp ready throughout winter months when storms frequently knocked out electricity. When the hens stopped laying and the butter money ran out, the cake still got made, because somebody's grandmother figured out that vinegar and baking soda could do the work of eggs if you let the chemistry happen fast enough. They called it wacky cake in parts of the Ozarks and crazy cake in the Appalachian foothills, and the recipe spread through church bulletins and hand-copied index cards during the 1930s when rationing made eggs and dairy unpredictable. You mixed the dry ingredients right in the baking pan: flour, sugar, cocoa, salt, baking soda, then poured vinegar, vegetable oil, and cold water over the top and stirred with a fork until the batter foamed and rose. No bowl to wash, no eggs to crack, no butter to soften. The vinegar reacted with the soda to produce carbon dioxide, and the bubbles gave the crumb its lift. What came out of the oven was dark, moist, and tender. Not a compromise, not a substitute, but a cake that earned its place at the table on its own terms. Venison stew with root vegetables was the essence of frontier survival, a slow-simmered meal that turned wild game into pure comfort. Hunters dressed the deer with practiced skill, saving every cut of meat for the long winter nights ahead. Thick pieces of venison browned in a cast-iron pot before joining chunks of potatoes, turnips, and carrots gathered from sparse gardens or traded from nearby homesteads. A splash of creek water and a handful of dried herbs created a broth that grew richer with every hour beside the fire. The stew cooked until the meat fell apart and the vegetables softened into a silky base that warmed chilled bones after a day in the cold. Families gathered with tin cups and rough bread, savoring each bite while the wind howled beyond the cabin walls. This simple dish brought hunters and children alike around the same pot, proving that careful effort and patience could turn a lean harvest into a feast. Today, few know the deep flavor of true venison cooked with such quiet attention. Soap sliver ball was a thrifty bathroom hack that transformed unusable soap remnants into functional new bars through simple household chemistry. Families saved every soap sliver too small to use effectively, collecting them in jars or bowls until enough accumulated. The slivers were then moistened, pressed together firmly, and molded by hand into new bars that worked as well as fresh soap. Some families added hot water to soften the pieces before combining them, creating smoother finished products. Others grated the slivers and packed them into molds, producing bars with interesting marbled patterns. Children often helped with this project, enjoying the tactile satisfaction of squishing soap pieces together. The practice eliminated waste entirely, ensuring that every bit of purchased soap served its purpose. This hack represented the mountain philosophy that Throwing away useful material was simply unacceptable when creativity could extend its life. Elk chili filled the high country air with a spice that warmed even the coldest night. Hunters prized elk for its lean yet deeply flavored meat, cubing it into hearty chunks before browning them with onions in heavy cast-iron pots. Dried chilies ground by hand released their smoky heat as they simmered with the meat, beans, and a ladle of mountain spring water. The mixture cooked slowly until the elk turned tender and the broth thickened into a bold, fiery stew. Camps smelled of pepper and pine as the chili bubbled, drawing weary travelers closer to the flames. A piece of hard bread or a handful of roasted corn often served as the only accompaniment, yet the chili satisfied every hunger. Each pot told a story of patience and strength, of hunters who respected the animal and used every part with gratitude. Modern chili packets and quick sauces cannot capture the deep, rugged flavor that came from real elk and long hours over an open fire in the quiet wilderness. Newspaper window insulation was the original weatherproofing solution that mountain families relied on when cold winds whistled through drafty cabins. Families collected old newspapers throughout the year, saving them specifically for winter when temperatures plummeted and heating fuel was precious. The technique involved wetting the newspaper slightly, then pressing it firmly against window glass where it would dry and adhere, creating a barrier against cold air. Some families layered multiple sheets, building up thickness that trapped air pockets and reduced heat loss dramatically. The newspaper could be peeled away come spring without damaging the glass, and the cost was absolutely nothing since papers were subscribed to or scavenged from town. Children often helped with this annual ritual, learning early that comfort didn't require spending money when clever thinking was available. The yellowed papers gave windows a peculiar tint, but nobody minded when the alternative was shivering through January nights. If you put soap on the skillet, you might as well have cursed in church. That was how seriously the old cooks took their cast iron. Instead of detergent, they grabbed a handful of coarse salt, poured it into the still warm pan, and scrubbed with a folded rag or a cut potato half. The salt acted as a gentle abrasive, lifting stuck-on food without stripping the seasoning built up over years. Kosher salt worked best because of its larger crystals, but in mountain kitchens where it was not available, they used rock salt or fine sand from the creek bed. After scrubbing, the pan was rinsed quickly, never soaked, dried over the stove's heat, and wiped with a thin coat of lard before it went back on the hook. That thin layer of fat sealed the pores of the iron, preventing rust and adding another coat to the black, glassy surface that made the pan practically non-stick. Soap was not forbidden out of superstition. The old lye-based soaps genuinely stripped seasoning, and they knew what they were protecting. Pioneer bean whole beans brought deep smoky richness to camps where slow cooking was a necessity and not a luxury. Cooks dug a pit in the earth and lined it with river stones heated in a roaring fire until they glowed red. A heavy pot filled with soaked beans, molasses, onions, and chunks of salt pork was placed inside, covered with more stones and earth, and left to bake overnight. Through the dark hours, the beans absorbed the heat and the scent of wood smoke, transforming into a dish of sweet and savory depth that greeted the dawn with irresistible aroma. Travelers would rise to the hiss of opening earth and the sight of steam lifting into the morning air. Served with rough bread or eaten straight from tin bowls, these beans nourished weary bodies after long days of hauling traps or splitting logs. The slow patience required feels foreign today, yet those who have tasted bean whole beans remember a flavor that no modern oven or stovetop can quite recreate. Salt ice cream maker was a summer hack that turned hot afternoons into frozen treat celebrations without requiring expensive equipment or electricity. Families would nest a small metal can inside a larger bucket, filling the space between with crushed ice and rock salt. The salt lowered the freezing point of the ice, creating temperatures cold enough to freeze cream mixture placed in the inner can. Children took turns cranking or shaking the apparatus, watching through patient labor as liquid transformed into creamy dessert. The process took 30 minutes or more of continuous effort, but the anticipation made the rewards sweeter. Homemade ice cream tasted richer than store-bought versions, made with fresh cream, sugar, and whatever flavorings the family had available. Vanilla extract was common, but summer berries or peaches from the orchard made seasonal variations that became family traditions passed down through generations of hot weather gatherings. The eggshells went in with the grounds, crushed between the palm and dropped right into the pot. And the coffee came out cleaner than any paper filter could manage. This was cowboy coffee and farmhouse coffee all the way back to the 1800s, and the trick was chemistry, not folklore. Crushed eggshells are mostly calcium carbonate, which is alkaline, and when the hot water hit them, they neutralized the acids in the coffee and pulled the loose grounds to the bottom of the pot. The result was a cup that was smoother, less bitter, and almost perfectly clear. No grit, no sludge, no grounds floating on top. In the mountains of East Tennessee and western North Carolina, old women swore the shells made the coffee taste sweeter, and they were not wrong. Reducing acidity lets the natural sweetness come forward. Albumin from the shell membrane acted as a clarifying agent, the same protein used in winemaking. She never called it that. She just called it making coffee right. Ash-roasted potatoes proved that even the simplest ingredient could taste extraordinary when cooked in the heart of a fire. Whole potatoes, scrubbed clean of dirt, were wrapped in damp cloth or left bare and buried beneath glowing embers. The ashes sealed in heat and smoky aroma while the skins blackened and the insides turned soft and creamy. After hours of slow roasting, mountain men raked the potatoes from the coals, brushing away soot to reveal steaming, fragrant flesh. A pinch of salt or a pat of butter transformed the humble tuber into a meal that felt almost luxurious after days of hard travel. The skin carried a subtle crunch while the interior held the essence of wood smoke and earth, a reminder of the land that provided it. Gathered around the dying fire, companions shared the potatoes with quiet appreciation, knowing that such simple food could keep spirits high and bodies strong. Few modern campfire dishes match the pure satisfaction of ash-roasted potatoes eaten under a starlit mountain sky. Flour paste wallpaper adhesive was homemade glue that hung wallpaper, sealed envelopes, and repaired torn books without requiring store-bought products. The recipe called for cooking flour and water together over low heat until the mixture thickened into smooth paste. The result was strong, flexible adhesive that dried clear and held paper firmly against surfaces. Families used this paste to decorate their homes with wallpaper scraps, catalog pages, or newspaper sheets, brightening otherwise plain wooden walls. The same paste sealed important letters, repaired children's school books, and attached labels to canning jars. Making paste became a household skill passed from mothers to daughters, with each family adjusting flour-to-water ratios based on experience. The paste cost virtually nothing and worked as well as commercial products for most paper applications. It represented self-sufficiency, proving that basic cooking skills could solve problems far beyond the kitchen. It looked ridiculous and worked perfectly. A leg of pantyhose hanging from a nail in the root cellar, bulging with onions spaced apart by knots tied between each one. The nylon mesh allowed air to circulate around every onion individually, preventing the moisture buildup that causes rot when onions touch each other in a bin. You tied a knot, dropped an onion, tied another knot, dropped another until the whole leg was full. When you needed one, you cut below the bottom knot and the rest stayed in place. Families across the upland South used this method from at least the 1940s onward, and a properly stored string could last 6 to 8 months, long enough to carry a household from fall harvest through to spring. The kids thought it was the funniest thing in the cellar. The woman who hung them there was not laughing. She was making sure there would be onions in the soup come February, and she was right every single time. Bear-fat biscuits carried the taste of hard wilderness living and the quiet ingenuity of hunters who used every resource. When butter or lard ran out, rendered bear fat provided a rich, earthy flavor and the perfect texture for flaky biscuits cooked in heavy cast-iron pans over open fires. Hunters melted the fat slowly to remove impurities, then mixed it with flour, a pinch of salt, and cold spring water to form a soft dough that baked into golden rounds. The biscuits emerged tender inside with crisp edges that held the subtle smokiness of the bear itself, making them a breakfast strong enough to last through hours of tracking or chopping wood. Families living deep in the mountains often saved bear hunts for late autumn when the animals were fattened for winter, ensuring the rendered fat would last for months of baking and frying. Modern kitchens rarely use such an ingredient, yet those who remember describe a depth of flavor and resilience that ordinary butter can never equal, a flavor earned through effort and respect for the wild. Cornmeal ant barrier was a pest control method that protected pantries and kitchens without toxic chemicals or expensive exterminators. Families discovered that sprinkling dry cornmeal along windowsills, doorways, and cabinet edges created a line that ants wouldn't cross. The theory held that ants would carry cornmeal back to their colonies where it would expand inside their digestive systems, eliminating the problem at its source. Whether scientifically accurate or not, the method worked well enough that families passed it down through generations. The cornmeal was cheap, safe around children and pets, and didn't require any special application beyond sprinkling it where ants appeared. Some families mixed the cornmeal with sugar to make it more attractive to foraging ants, increasing its effectiveness as bait. This hack remained popular precisely because it used an ingredient every mountain kitchen already stocked, turning pantry staples into practical pest solutions. The jar sat on the back of the stove like it had been born there, a cloudy glass container full of rendered fat, yellowed and layered with the ghost of every meal that came before it. Every kitchen in the rural South and across Appalachia kept a grease jar, usually an old coffee tin or a mason jar with a dented lid, and it was refilled every time bacon or salt pork hit the skillet. That fat was not waste. It was the starting point for everything. Fried eggs slid into the hot grease at dawn, cornbread batter poured into a smoking cast iron pan, green beans simmered low with a dollop stirred in for depth. During the Depression, families stretched a single pound of bacon across a week by saving every drop of rendered fat and using it as the primary cooking oil for every other meal. The jar never emptied because it was never allowed to. It sat there, warm and waiting, and if you grew up reaching past it to grab a plate, you knew what it was without being told. Sourdough flapjacks carried a lively tang that could only come from a starter nurtured day after day on long trapping trips through rugged country. Mountain men kept a small crock of bubbling batter tied close to their packs, feeding it with flour and water at each camp so the wild yeasts of the frontier stayed alive. Before dawn, they stirred the mixture with fresh spring water and poured it onto hot iron griddles balanced over open flames, the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and the sharp, sweet aroma of fermenting grain as golden rounds puffed and browned. A drizzle of tree sap syrup or a pat of hard-packed butter turned the flapjacks into a breakfast both hearty and satisfying enough to fuel a day of hunting or trail breaking. Even in deep snow or high wind, the starter endured, becoming a living link to home for those who might not see another settlement for months. Few modern pancakes can match the flavor earned from so much patience and wilderness care. Egg carton. Fire starters turned kitchen waste into reliable kindling that could ignite reluctant firewood on cold mornings. Families saved cardboard egg cartons throughout the year, filling each cup with dryer lint, sawdust, or small wood shavings. Melted candle wax or bacon grease was poured over the mixture, creating compact fire-starting pods that burned hot and long enough to catch larger wood. Each carton yielded a dozen individual starters that could be stored indefinitely in dry locations. The hack solved the perpetual challenge of starting fires in wood stoves and fireplaces, especially during damp weather when kindling refused to catch. One pod placed beneath arranged firewood could have flames roaring within minutes, eliminating the frustration of failed fire attempts. Mountain families kept supplies of these starters ready throughout winter months, knowing reliable heat was essential to survival. When butter was dear, and it almost always was, the trick was to stretch it. You took a quarter pound of butter, softened it to room temperature, then whipped it with a fork or a wooden spoon while slowly adding 2 or 3 tablespoons of cold water and a pinch of salt. The water emulsified into the fat, increasing the volume by nearly a third without changing the taste enough for anyone to notice on a hot biscuit or a slab of cornbread. Depression-era households across the rural South and Midwest used this trick to make a single pound of butter last the week, and some added a splash of evaporated milk instead of water for a creamier result. The salt masked the slight dilution and helped preserve the spread in kitchens without reliable refrigeration. It was not a recipe. It was math. The math of making less feel like enough. And the woman who did it never told anyone at the table that the butter was different, because pride mattered as much as the meal. Corn dodger cakes were dense patties of cornmeal fried in bacon grease, built to endure long hunts and endless trails. Trappers stirred ground corn with hot water and a touch of salt, shaping the mixture into thick rounds that held together without eggs or milk. Dropped into sizzling grease, they crisped on the outside while staying firm inside, creating a portable bread that resisted spoilage. Wrapped in cloth, the cakes traveled in saddlebags and coat pockets, ready to be eaten cold or warmed briefly over a fire. Their sturdy texture and rich smoky flavor gave quick energy to hunters crossing ridges or rivers. Many men claimed the taste improved after a day in the pack as the bacon fat soaked deeper into the corn. At night, the cakes served as both side dish and main meal when meat was scarce. Today, the name survives mostly in old stories, but the hearty crunch of a true corn dodger remains a symbol of rugged independence and frontier practicality. Butter wrapper greaser was a frugal technique that squeezed every bit of value from purchased butter by saving wrappers for greasing baking pans. Families carefully preserved the waxy paper wrappers after unwrapping butter sticks, folding them and storing them in kitchen drawers. When recipes called for greased pans, these saved wrappers provided enough residual butter to coat surfaces without using additional product. Children learned early to smooth wrappers flat rather than crumpling them, maximizing the usable surface area. The wrappers worked perfectly for cake pans, cookie sheets, and bread loaf tins, preventing sticking without any waste. Some families stored wrappers in the refrigerator to keep the butter residue fresh, while others kept them at room temperature for easier spreading. This simple habit saved measurable amounts of butter over time, stretching grocery budgets in households where every penny counted. These hacks kept families alive through storms that had no mercy and no end. Which one do your own people still remember?